Assalamu alaikum. This is going to be me reacting to the recent Propaganda and Co podcast, right? So many of you guys reached out to me and said, Tox, look at what Jackson Hinkle is saying. What is all this stuff that he's saying about Bashar al-Assad? What do we believe? Because he's one of the stronger voices out there for Palestine. So, inshallah ta'ala, in this podcast, I haven't done one of these videos for a while, but I'm going to watch the whole thing. I've watched little segments here and there, but this is the first time I'm going to be watching all of it. Inshallah, I'm going to try my best to try and explain to you guys any of the truths and any of the falsehoods regarding Syria, inshallah ta'ala. So let's get this underway.
He rose to fame shortly after the Russia-Ukraine war and has since amassed over 2 million followers. He's been banned off of various social media platforms, allegedly for amplifying conspiracy theories, disinformation, and pro-Russian and pro-Chinese propaganda.
Calling himself, and I'm not kidding you, a MAGA communist. I mean, what the heck is a MAGA communist anyway?
He was one of the most vocal critics of the Israeli response to the October 7th attacks. And Israeli media has described him as a Holocaust and October 7th denier.
I want to find out your thoughts about Hamas. Do you agree that they are a terrorist bunch of scumbags or not?
Do you agree that the Israeli military
answer
are a bunch
the question.
of terrorist scumbags?
I'll answer your question. I'll answer
your question when you answer my question. Is the Israeli military a bunch of terrorist scumbags?
So that Talk TV interview is really interesting because he's got more balls than some other Muslims that went on there when it came to speaking about the resistance.
In fierce debates with pro-Ukrainian and pro-Israeli figures, and has even been part of major Twitter space discussions with the likes of Alex Jones, Andrew Tate, and even Elon Musk. Many of his positions are controversial, as he describes himself as pro-Putin, pro-Assad, and pro-China. He also denies the Uyghur genocide. We sat down to discuss these positions, as well as various political views and his ideological evolution. Propaganda & Co. is a young startup channel with no...
So this is interesting. He describes himself as pro-Putin, pro-Bashar, denies the Uyghur genocide. These are things that he says himself, so there's no dispute here. The question is he now making people who are in the middle or people who were once ferociously against Bashar start to have some affinity for him? And that's where the danger lies.
You are described as an American right-wing conservative, MAGA pro-Trump communist, a Marxist-Leninist, and anti-globalist. You were once an environmentalist, now you're described as pro-fossil fuels. You're also known to be pro-gun. This is how you're described online. But I want to hear from you. Who is Jackson Hinkle, and how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I think it's crazy how much Wikipedia tries to, manufacture consent for these issues. And anytime there's someone who's like challenging the pro-war establishment, they try to put all those crazy labels on them and stuff. But I think overall it's actually kind of close. I definitely consider myself a communist. MAGA communism it's just a term, it's a slogan that was kind of created because a lot of communists in America write off the Trump base, the working class movement in this country, call them all racist or misogynistic or whatever, when in actuality the MAGA working class is basically the only like politically class conscious movement in America that we have. So I don't necessarily support Trump. I don't even think I'm going to vote for him in this coming election, but I definitely stand with the movement. And one of my good friends who coined the term MAGA communism, he describes it as like, you don't go to McDonald's for, the clown, for Ronald McDonald, you go there for the Big Mac. Or so it's like, it's the same thing. We don't support Trump for Trump, but for the movement. But I guess conservative on some issues. Culturally, yes, that's correct. But my primary focus in the work that I do, political commentary, is mostly about foreign policy. So that's where the anti-imperialism, anti-globalism is really important to everything that I discuss. So I think it's a pretty accurate description by Wikipedia.
Speaking of the elections, if you're not going to vote for Trump, who would you vote for?
No one. I think it's incumbent upon the politicians to earn your vote. So if there's no one that is really worth supporting, you have Donald Trump, who's, call him Zion Don for a reason. You got Joe Biden, who's barely alive. You got, and started like world wars and, all across the globe. You got RFK Jr., who's probably the most rabid Zionist of all of them, actually. And he's a China hawk. And then you got, who else? Cornel West. That guy's a joke. And I think that's pretty much it. Am I missing any?
Jill Stein, I think she's running again for the Green Party.
Jill Stein is a snake, so I don't personally, like, I just have had interactions with her for years.
So really interesting. He says that he's not going to be voting for Trump, Biden, or anybody else in the upcoming election because they're pro-Zionist. So he has a really strong, staunch stance against the Zionist Israeli regime.
And she's a snake, so there's no one really that I trust and I'd give my full support to. If I'm not willing to donate like $500 to them, why should I vote for them? Because a vote is way more important than that.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about Jill Stein. Not too much, but I am curious to hear why you think she's a snake. I don't necessarily agree with her on everything, but I find her to be maybe one of the more principled candidates. But why do you think that she's a snake?
Well, I think the biggest thing you can look to, I mean, yeah, we agree on a lot of issues, I'm sure, right? But one of the biggest things I think you can look to is how she really handled and maneuvered herself in this election. Dr. Cornel West was running an independent campaign for president. Actually, he was initially running with a third party called the People's Party. Then he switched to independent, and then he switched to the Green Party. And the Green Party it's horrible. It's saddled with like allegedly hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. It's just a complete management catastrophe. And Jill Stein was the one that encouraged Cornel West to join the Green Party and to run for president with the Green Party. So when I saw that, I was just really confused. I was like, well, you know, he should have been People's Party or independent. That would have been a much better path, I think, if he's trying to actually be an independent challenge. Then he goes to the Green Party. And what does Jill Stein do? Because she was leading up a lot of the, you know, the management of his campaign. I think she was like a co-chair or something to that effect. They bring in Peter Dow, who's a longtime Hillary Clinton like confidant and campaign person, to come and manage Cornel West's campaign. So when I saw that, I was thinking to myself, well, why would Jill Stein bring someone like Peter Dow in who's just going to suck money out of this working class base of Cornel West supporters that want to see someone do something good? And then what ended up happening was Peter Dow tanked the campaign. It went nowhere. He probably stole hundreds of thousands of dollars by operating as like a campaign manager for several months. And then we're left with Cornel West out of the Green Party, essentially out of the race now. I mean, he's like a nobody right now in terms of his campaign. And then Jill Stein takes over the Green Party nomination. Almost kind of looked like she brought in Cornel to tank him and then pushed him out and then took over the nomination for the Green Party. And of course, she doesn't have Peter Dow working on her campaign. So I thought it was very snakish, and I don't think you can trust someone who's still working with the Democratic Party as they try to claim to be an outsider candidate that's going to challenge the establishment.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like you and Jimmy Dore maybe are aligned on this perspective. A lot of people don't know this about you, and they're shocked when I tell them this, but you're only 24 years old. Mm-hmm. You grew up in San Clemente, California. Yep. Is that how you pronounce it? You were big on surfing, painting, and playing the guitar. You organized environmental cleanups, and at the age of 19, you ran for city council in a special election. How did you first get involved in politics, and why did you run for office at such a young age?
Well,
I mean, that is really, really interesting. He's only 24 years of old. 24 years old.
San Clemente, I was just like concerned about the environment because I was a surfer. So you go out to surf in the morning, you see like trash all over the beach. It's a nuisance, right? So you want to basically keep your house in order, keep your house tidy. And that was my views on environmentalism. I started an environmental club when I was in high school. And then through the people I met, the groups I was associated with, I guess I kind of just became connected with and indoctrinated with the sort of more ideological lean on environmentalism. And I was surrounded by like very, very well-meaning but liberal people that I think kind of led me in a way that I wouldn't have normally gone down, like a path I wouldn't have chosen myself if I hadn't have been associated with them. So, growing up in Orange County, it's a very conservative, it's the most conservative area probably in all of California. So that was interesting. And, but I was genuinely interested, I guess, and invested in that sort of politics, the progressive movement, Bernie Sanders, all that stuff. But very quickly, I came to realize that all the people that were preaching, peace and anti-interventionism were either covertly or directly supporting it, including Bernie Sanders even, and were working, I guess, at the behest as a lapdog almost of the Democratic Party establishment. And when I say the Democratic Party establishment, I mean like the uniparty, this pro-war deep state that we have governing our country today. So through seeing what these people that I was looking up to as kind of movement leaders were lying about on various issues of war related to Russia or to Iran or to Syria or Israel, whatever it may be. Even like, look at Tulsi Gabbard. She's one of the biggest Zionists out there, but she's really good on other issues. So through all that stuff, I kind of became disenchanted with the progressive movement because I found out their anti-war politics really weren't all that anti-war, and neither are the Republicans for that matter, who are the anti-interventionists. And eventually, somewhere in there, I ran for city council, did okay. I was like 18 years old, but that was local issues. It had nothing to do with national politics. And then eventually I started my own YouTube show and just started to follow all these global events that we're witnessing. It's a really crazy time to be alive. And that's how I eventually got here.
Speaking of your YouTube show, it's called The Dive with Jackson Hinkle. Is it still called The Dive now that you're on Rumble?
So yeah, still called The Dive, but not on YouTube.
Not on YouTube. So you were banned and deplatformed from YouTube, and I believe Twitch as well. Is that right?
Twitch was first.
Twitch was first.
Yeah.
And before that, you had about 400,000 followers on Twitter before the recent Israel-Palestine war. You now have over 2.4 million followers. When and how did you first start going viral?
I think, mostly like the Russia-Ukraine stuff was, basically my career just went, I debated a popular YouTuber named Vosh, who's actually been in the news recently for some very troubling events. We debated about the OPCW cover-up scandal in Duma, Syria, and that went kind of viral. I debated a guy named Sam Cedar about the progressive movement, the failures of it when it came to anti-war politics. And then the Russia-Ukraine war began, and that was where I really jumped up a lot in followers, and I followed that very closely for like a year and a half, almost 2 years. And then the Israel-Gaza conflict, reared its ugly head again. And I think everyone was just so shocked to see the level of like depravity that is being exhibited by Israel in this current episode, because I had a YouTube channel when I was probably around 2019 when there was like the protests and the events happening, all the bombing campaigns and stuff then. So I covered that on my YouTube show and was having conversations with Max Blumenthal about that back then. But I think just, again, the level of bloodshed and depravity we're seeing this time is what caused so many people to really seek out the truth and the information about what's happening. And that's when my YouTube channel was banned right before all this started happening, when I was in Russia. And then this started, and everything on Twitter and Instagram blew up as well.
Why do you think you were banned off YouTube?
I'm very pro-Russian. So as an American, to be pro-Russian, I'm pro-American first and foremost, but look, my grandfather, our grandfathers as Americans fought hand in hand with the Soviets in World War II to defeat fascism. Now we're funding the Nazis in Ukraine in this proxy war against Russia. And there's a lot of money involved in it, and there's vested interest in continuing this war for as long as possible. So when you have someone saying we should have peace and exposing a lot of these lies and going on Tucker Carlson or Piers Morgan and talking about these issues, and then eventually even going to Russia like I did and trying to show the normal life of people in Russia, which is what Tucker Carlson's doing right now. He's showing grocery stores and metros, and everyone's like, oh my gosh. I did that too, and I feel like when you show that stuff, especially in the heat of the Ukraine war, that's when you get a lot of the censorship that comes into play. And I also went to RT, was on their show. I went to the memorial of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and I think all those events kind of set off red flags, and they're like, all right, get rid of this kid,
So there are other people who are pro-Russia on YouTube. Do you think maybe it's because you just had so much success and that you were maybe shaping the opinion more than these other people? Like, Is that why maybe that you were removed?
That could be. I mean, I think it was like me, Jimmy Dore, Redacted with Clayton Morris, Scott Ritter, and Douglas McGregor, who are probably the biggest voices on Russia. So I definitely think that had something to do with it. But I think going to Russia, I mean, I was the only one that actually, I think Scott went to Russia after me. I mean, he's been to Russia in the past, but I think I was the first one to go there during this madness. And I think that probably was a no-no for the YouTube censors.
You're right.
So it's really interesting because him being a pro-Russian voice in the Ukrainian conflict got him banned from YouTube, and it just goes to show you or highlight one of the massive flaws in so-called Western democratic freedom of speech. The reality is, my dear brothers and sisters, it doesn't exist. Not even for people like Jackson, who are, describe themselves as communists, pro-Russian. There's a narrative that the West wants to put out. If you are opposed to that, then you will be cancelled.
You're right. So you've noticed then, of course, this trend of anti-mainstream media content producers getting banned from platforms for holding opposing views. What do you think this means for free speech in the West?
Well, I think that, and that's why I found you initially when you did the October 7th video, and that went so viral, and I was just like, hell yeah, there's more and more people coming up and saying the truth. And
so that's the question. That's exactly the question. How do Westerners feel about this, the encroachment of freedom of speech?
I think it's really good. It's essentially, going to be, if it succeeds, the final nail in the coffin of the corporate mainstream media establishment. But those in charge, of course, want to turn the internet into what any of our streaming services are right now. They want it to be completely gate-kept. They want it to be just certain voices that are allowed to reach the masses. And they do that through ghost bans and censorship and outright bans. And I think everyone's seen that over the course of the Israel-Gaza events that have occurred since October 7th. A lot, we've seen it. But it's very troubling. I mean, I've been to China. I've been on Chinese media. I've been to Russia. I've been on Russian media quite a bit. And I can definitely say that, each country has varying levels of censorship and varying levels of what is implicitly kind of allowed and not allowed to say when you go out on the press. But the United States has the most horrific and authoritarian censorship regime that I've ever witnessed, and we're living through it right now. And some people will say, well, in Russia, you'll get locked up in prison if you say something. And it's like, well, everyone kind of knows what you can and can't say in Russia, first of all, And the other fact of the matter is, look at the United States. They don't have to imprison us to completely silence us. It's very costly. It's very unpopular politically to imprison dissidents, whether they have stupid views or good views. If they can just censor you entirely across all of big tech, that's a way more effective way of silencing the masses, and that's why they do it. But they also censor Julian Assange. They lock him up in Belmarsh prison. They're trying to kill him. There's been many journalists whose names that are slipping my memory right now who, exposed the Clinton family, who end up disappeared in one way or another. You have Gonzalo Lira, who's just killed in Ukraine by the Ukrainian authorities. So we do have that to a lesser extent, but it's very troubling. Everyone has thrown the First Amendment out the window.
It's interesting you bring up reach. It sounds like in America, they'll say, well, we're not really violating your right to speech, but what they do is they sever your reach. So you can say whatever you want, you just can't say it to anyone or reach anyone.
Yeah, and that's the argument that I hope Trump makes if he gets reelected. He kind of put the argument up in his last term, but didn't go through with it. And I think it's called Section 270 or something. It's the argument that these big tech platforms are legally protected from any sort of a free speech lawsuit because they say, we're just the platform. We're not a, editorial manager of the platform. But it's well, if you guys are saying we're going to ban this person or censor this person or target this person for their political views, then you are in effect acting as an editor of sorts. So I think it should be challenged legally. It'll be a huge fight, but it'd be interesting to see how it plays out.
So transitioning now, let's talk about Russia-Ukraine in more detail.
So yeah, really, really interesting, the whole discussion about censorship. It will be interesting to see that if Donald Trump is re-elected, is that going to make a difference? Obviously, Elon Musk taking over X has made a massive difference, even though he's still banning certain people. But the question is, if you control big tech, you can control the narrative.
You've been described as pro-Russia and pro-Putin, and we know you were deplatformed for your critique of NATO and the U.S. in the context of this war. You've debated some of the most influential pro-Ukraine influencers and journalists in this space, and you've been placed on a Ukrainian list of pro-Russia propagators. Can you clarify your views on Russia and tell us why you've been so passionate about your positions on this war?
Yeah, I think that every American patriot should support Russia in their special military operation. To put it briefly, because what's happening right now in Ukraine is it's a proxy war that was established on a years-long effort to foment regime change in Ukraine, put in people that would be subservient to the West, and then attack Russia. And that's exactly what they did. You know, it's kind of like what Joe Biden says about Israel. He said if there wasn't an Israel, we'd have to go out and create one to serve our interests in the region. It's the same thing in Ukraine. Like, Ukraine was a government, in 2014 that was somewhat moderate between Russia and the EU. And then when some protests started to happen for legitimate reasons about, maybe meshing trade further with the EU or being closer aligned to Russia, the CIA and the State Department stepped in and said, we're going to radicalize these protesters. We're going to start arming, these Nazi groups in Ukraine. Eventually, they took over the whole country. They couped the president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was duly elected. They failed to impeach him when they tried to in 2014. They were very violent. They killed dozens and dozens of people. And then after they took over the country, obviously the pro-Russian parts of Russia and the East were upset with that, so they began to protest. And what happened when they began to protest? That Nazi Ukrainian government, and when I say Nazis, I mean like actual ideological inheritors of people like Stefan Bandera, who were allied with the Nazis in World War II, those individuals in Ukraine and Kiev began to slaughter the ethnic Russians. They killed 15,000 people over 8 years. They bombed schools, hospitals, homes, churches. It was horrific. And they also slaughtered people in Odessa, which is in the south on the ocean. So, I think that what Putin is doing in Ukraine is an effort to stamp out those Nazis, get rid of them, get NATO right off his border, because, again, all these people in Ukraine right now, their government, their military, the only reason why they've been doing this stuff against ethnic Russians and the Russian state for the past, 8+ years is because of NATO directives. And Putin, all he wants is sovereignty. He wants freedom. He wants sovereignty. He wants a fair world order rather than one that's controlled by the United States. And I think he's been very successful. I mean, they've controlled like 26% of Ukrainian territory, liberated it. They've unfortunately, as a cost of war, about 500,000 Ukrainians have been killed. Many of those people are non-ideological. They were conscripted, forced to go fight. About only 150,000 Russians have died. So in terms of a, military appraisal of this war, Russia's been very successful. They've been successful economically with the sanctions. Their economy is now the 5th largest economy in the world. It's the top largest economy in Europe. And, I think that everything that's taking place with BRICS and de-dollarization it's very hopeful for, I guess, the multipolar world, and even countries like Iran or, Yemen or Palestine, and to see what's going to be becoming of this new world where the United States doesn't control everybody.
Why do you think it's important for people in the West to be informed about the specifics of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I mean, they're sending all of our cash there. It's crazy how much cash they're sending there. It's like over $200 billion. This week, they want to send another $60 billion over. And most importantly, I mean, we're we're dealing with Russia. Personally, I don't think Putin's crazy. I think he's a very predictable, maybe even too much of a laid-back leader, given the issues he has to face. But the media always tells us that Putin's some crazy, tyrannical, unhinged leader. If that's the case, then why are we violating red line after red line after red line with Russia, doing everything that they say not to do? I mean, we all know Russia is a nuclear power. Russia has hypersonic missiles that the United States doesn't have, so they actually have a more advanced missile system than we do. They've got a huge military that is very sharp. They did a lot of work in Syria in the air. They did a lot of work on the ground and in the air in Ukraine. I wouldn't want to have to go fight against Russians or Chechens or any of those guys. And the prospects of sending young American boys to go fight in a war for what? To try and weaken Russia? I mean, that's insane, but it's kind of where we're headed right now. So I think all those reasons. I mean, if you're an American, you live in any major city, you see how much they've degraded. We should be concerned with, freeing our own country of these outside foreign influences that are trying to force us into these wars and send more money abroad. We need to focus on the issues here at home, and you can't do that if you're sending all of our tax base abroad.
So this is really interesting. A lot of Americans are being disenchanted because they see that America's falling apart in some places. You've got these zombie cities, you've got all of these difficulties going on, homelessness, etc., right? Yet America always has hundreds and billions of dollars for war. And people can see it. You're spending hundreds of billions in Ukraine, but yet we have all of these issues. They don't even have a free health service. So this is why, people are seeing that, becoming disenchanted. But it's just, Jackson, to have someone who's so pro-Russian and even going on Russian media and Chinese media, is he a paid stooge? Allahu Alam.
Prior to October 7th, you had about 400,000 followers on Twitter. Your relentless and abrasive style of challenging and exposing Israeli propaganda earned you millions of followers. You were engaged in direct back and forth tweets with official Israeli government accounts. The Israeli media actually listed you, Max Blumenthal, and myself as propagandists responsible for Holocaust denial and October 7th denial. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not.
There's a Haaretz article where us three are mentioned. Tell me about your experience countering propaganda during this war and why you're so supportive of the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, really, that's how it kind of started, because I've always been supportive of Palestine for years, since I really started to know anything about foreign policy and stuff. And I remember it was a friend that the first time I ever heard of it was a friend said, you got to support the BDS movement. I'm like, the what? The what? And I had to go home and look it up. And I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. And I think that was in 2018. And, but when it came to October 7th, obviously I support the resistance, right? That's a no-brainer. But the craziest part about October 7th wasn't even the events that were unfolding or about to unfold.
So it's crazy. Some of the stuff he says, even about BDS boycott and divestment and stuff, right? Shows how young he is. I'm still quite shocked that he's only 24 years old.
Thereafter, the craziest part about October 7th was all the lies and the level of propaganda that they were trying to use, as we all knew, to justify what they were then going to do. And everyone was aware of it. The green bandana men were aware of it. Everyone knew what was about to happen. They were going to commit a horrific, some degree of war and invasion against Gaza. And I think there was such a level of shock that we saw on October 7th. And it reminded me of February 24th of 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, and you had CNN, you had Fox News going out and saying oh my God, they're bombing Zelensky's palace, they're on the streets of Kiev. It's such insane lies. But you need to counter those lies, because if you don't, then there's going to be popular consensus amongst the American public and Western publics to go and do whatever to the people of Russia or the people of Gaza. So that's why it's important to counter the lies.
There's something I'd like you to clarify. It's pretty clear now.
So when he's speaking about Palestine, he's spot on. when it comes to our position, the Muslim position, he's spot on. When it comes to the propaganda, when it comes to the Zionist, propaganda machine and all of the Western media, he's spot on. And that's why it's very easy to become confused with what he's saying, because he's so, you could say, so powerful in his defense of the Palestinians.
It's pretty clear now that you're opposed to Netanyahu and his regime, but there's a clip of you from a few years ago speaking positively of Netanyahu because of his relationship with Putin and Russia, and you seem to think that he was an ally of the multipolar transition. What prompted your change of opinion about Netanyahu? Was it his agenda, or did you discover new information about him, or was it something else entirely?
No, that clip has gone so viral, which is funny, but it's clipped out of context. And I stand by what I said, because it's exactly what Nasrallah said, the head of Hezbollah. It's like
Very, very interesting. So there's apparently a clip of him praising Netanyahu, and now he's changed his mind. And now he said even Nasrallah, he's using Nasrallah, the head of Lebanese militia, Hezbollah, to back up his point. So let's hear what he's got to say.
Netanyahu, and maybe it's a bit controversial for some people, but Netanyahu is a force that accelerates the multipolar world. And some people might think, like, what do you mean by that? He's obviously, you hate him, he's a genocidal leader. But the fact of the matter is, his actions are so brutal, so insane, so unthinkable, that it causes the rest of the world to band around Gaza and the resistance. It causes the rest of the world to question, the current statehood status of Palestine and the status of Israel as a country. It basically accelerates, the victories of the Palestinian resistance. And that's why Nasrallah said it, because he said, between him and the previous coalition, or between him and someone that they might seek to eventually put into power, which I think is what, the U.S. administration currently wants to do. I think Biden wants to get rid of Netanyahu. I think the State Department would love to get rid of Netanyahu. I think they want someone who's going to be far more of a, humane militarist, a more liberal figure within Israel, who will carry out the genocide in a very quiet manner, who will do this over a long period of time rather than the horrific acts we've seen since October 7th.
So that's really interesting. He's praising Netanyahu because he's saying that he's just making Israel's crimes more apparent. So it's a very strange position.
If you have someone like that leading in Israel, the odds of the whole world waking up to what's happening there, like we've seen over the past several months, are highly unlikely. The odds of Palestine or Gaza or wherever, I don't know what we can say on here, dealing a bloody nose to the Israeli military is highly unlikely. The odds of Palestinian statehood being recognized by Russia and China at the UN Security Council is highly unlikely. So I think...
So it's interesting as well, he used, and he said, I don't know what we can say on here as YouTube, dealing a bloody nose. That's actually something that Dr. Abdul Wahid said on Piers Morgan's show, and he got cancelled for it, lost his job as a doctor as well. It's interesting, and he's saying if it wasn't for Netanyahu, the Palestinians wouldn't have had that kind of reaction, because America wants someone who's going to do a quiet genocide, which I think, again, is pretty accurate.
I think that as terrible as he is, there's a silver lining in the sense that it kind of catapults victory for the Palestinian resistance.
I see what you're saying. Speaking of this transition from the unipolar world to the multipolar world, can you tell us what this transition is and why it matters?
Yeah, the unipolar world is the idea that American imperialism reigns supreme, that they have the authority to tell any other country across the globe how it is, how it should be, and they have to suck it up and agree with that. And if they don't, they'll come in and launch a regime change or some sort of a CIA color revolution, or even a war or something like that. And also, it's about the economic and cultural superiority of the United States. Economic being you have to do trade with all the U.S. and our partners. And again, if you don't, we're going to cause problems with you. You have to use the dollar, or the euro in the case of Europe. Don't think about dealing in your sovereign currencies. Don't think about doing bilateral trade in rubles or yuan or something like that. And that causes a lot of problems for these countries. Also, you can look at the raw resources of these countries. Are you allowed to nationalize them or not? You know, the nationalization of oil and gas has always been a big issue for countries all across the world, because when they do it, they get a war that comes. So that's important. The cultural aspect is kind of new. That's the idea that, like, if you don't agree with the woke agenda of the United States, you might face problems, or you might not if you're like Al-Qaeda in Syria. We supported them anyways. But the multipolar era is basically...
So he just slipped something in there, right? That we supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. This is interesting, as in America. And he clearly sees the hypocrisy of America and the way that they control the world in forcing people to use dollars, not allowing them to nationalize their own, resources, etc., etc.
A structure of global governance that says it's not just the United States and the United Kingdom that are going to tell the world how everything will operate. You will have other poles of culture and power, like in Russia or China, maybe like the Shia-dominated centric order of Iran, and you've got their allies with the Alawites in Syria, and you've got Yemen and Hezbollah. You've got South America, which presents some sort of a threat. So you have all these converging powers that are becoming...
Interesting how he specifically mentioned Shia powers of Iran, Hezbollah, Yemen. That's an interesting point. He just kind of threw that out there nonchalantly, but let's see. I think there's clues in that.
More economically powerful, more powerful with their militaries, and really developing, or I guess maybe in some cases, revisiting and revitalizing their own sovereign cultures and not bending the knee to the United States. So why that's important, briefly, I guess, is for any country that can't fight for sovereignty on their own, the multipolar world will provide them with an avenue to have safety measures in place to make sure that they can do so. When it came to the war in Ukraine, Russia was kind of on their own, but they had prepared for this for years. They knew they were going to be sanctioned. They knew they were going to be removed from the SWIFT banking system. So they developed their alternatives. They said, okay, we're going to focus on further industrialization of our country, tapping into our own raw minerals and resources, and creating an alternative to the SWIFT international monetary system called MIR. So when you have those sort of structures in place now with countries like Russia, countries like China, the BRICS grouping, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that allow for trade and military transfers through all these countries that challenge the West, that's when you could potentially have countries like Yemen and Palestine not only receive some sort of like a diplomatic recognition, but a true sovereign power that they'll now have a leg to essentially stand on. I'd like to transition now maybe to a more controversial topic. Sounds good, so...
Interesting. So he's saying that Russia, China, all of these countries could potentially be an avenue for Yemen, Palestine, and these countries to stand on their own 2 feet.
I'd like to talk to you about your support for Bashar al-Assad. You've described him as a hero, and this has earned you the ire of many Muslim and Arab anti-Assadists. You are now seen as an Assadist. Just by taking a picture with you, I have been called an Assadist. And I'm sure after speaking with you today, people will continue to call me an Assadist.
So this is interesting. I like the way the brother's brought it up. I don't know too much about this brother, but mashallah, he's asked him straight up about his support for Bashar al-Assad.
I'll clarify briefly that I'm not an Assadist.
And he's clarifying that he's not an Assadist, which is good. Alhamdulillah.
Before I let you explain your views on Assad in Syria, I just want to provide the following information for our viewers. So Bashar al-Assad has a decades-long reputation of ruling the country with an iron fist. He came into power in 2000 after his father, the former president, died. He was too young to become president, but the parliament swiftly amended the constitution for him to come into power. Many critics point to this, among other events such as potentially rigged elections, as evidence that there isn't any real democratic politics in Syria. Bashar comes from a minority sect in Syria, the Alawites, who make up less than 10% of the population. Many Sunni Muslims who make up the majority of the Syrian population feel that the Alawites have disproportionate economic and political power in Syria.
Which is 100% true. If you don't know about the Alawite minorities in Syria and how they were put into power post-colonization, this is very important. The West has done this in many, many places. After they leave a place that they colonized, they put people in power that would have more affinity and basically do what they say. In many cases, they were the minorities, because the minorities would always seek the support of the West, because they knew that if they had that support, they could keep power and not cede it over to those who were the actual majority in those countries, and Syria being one of those. It's very important also to know that the Alawis or the Alawites in Syria are different to the Alavis in Turkey, right? And generally the Shias, most of the Shias also believe that the Alawites, the Bashar regime, these people are kuffar, disbelievers, heretics, non-Muslims, because of their strange views. And a lot of their views are very, very secretive. But this is a whole different topic.
And in 2011, the Arab Spring protests erupted in Syria against Bashar al-Assad. Those protests and the Syrian regime's response would eventually evolve into a more than decade-long conflict that persists until today. It's estimated that more than 600,000 people were killed in this war and millions displaced internally and across the world. I know many Syrians, some friends of mine, of different faiths and all across the spectrums of religiosity, who don't hold such a flattering view of Assad and his regime. Setting aside the West's intervention, I think most people will admit that the West had an imperialist agenda in Syria. Many would probably even agree that the CIA plotted to have him overthrown. However, they'll say that doesn't take away from the Assad regime's crimes. So when you call Bashar al-Assad a hero, it's undoubtedly going to be insulting to large factions of Syrians whose family members were killed and tortured before, during, and after the Syrian war. What I'd like you to do now is clarify your position on Bashar al-Assad, tell us why you describe him as a hero, and how you would characterize his governance in Syria.
So take my hats off to the brother. The way he asked it, the way he framed the question, with all that background information, is really, really good.
Well, it's hard to have any one opinion about someone that you can condense down into a single question answer. But I guess when I look at Assad and I say he's a hero, and I say as an American patriot I stand with him.
See, what I find is a clear contradiction is here when he says he's an American patriot, but yet he is vehemently opposed to all American policy intervention anywhere, right? And he seems more of a Russian patriot than anything else.
Or any leader for that matter, be it Putin or Xi Jinping. I mean, I can appreciate things about what they do for their own countries while also recognizing that there are issues. Nothing's perfect. But the main thing that I look at when I look at, the IRGC or Yemen or Putin or Assad is not any of that, how they actually govern their countries, but what are they doing in the struggle against imperialism? Because I do think that's heroic. We've seen far too many good leaders die in the name of struggling against imperialism.
So basically, if you're struggling against imperialism, doesn't matter how many people you kill, then you are a hero.
Their families tortured, their families killed, entire countries ruined, economies ruined, people forced into starvation and poverty, and then thereafter living decades of generational, basically enslavement to Western installed leaders. So, I don't want to live in, Sharia law Iran, right? But I can appreciate what they're doing against the imperialist actors. As for Assad, though, in Syria, I do think that it's a very interesting history and one that...
So, again, this is why the Islamic position is so different. This guy has an anti-imperial agenda. You can see he's very pro-Russian. For him, as long as you're anti-imperialism, you can kill as many people as you want. Now, this is something about the Islamic position which separates us, is the fact that even though there are, you could say, isms or countries that are enemies of Islam, opposing the Islamic position, we would never ever say that it's okay to kill as many people as you want and justify that, because we are furthering our own issue. If anything, the Prophet ﷺ, when he came, he put strict rules on how jihad, how war and wars should be fought. And that's what separates us. We should not become like these people who just kill as many people as they can and commit genocides because they're furthering an agenda. That's not the Islamic way.
And one that's often lied about by countries and media outlets that I think in other instances, like in the case of Gaza, we consider allies. And that's also a subject for another time, I guess, what Al Jazeera has done in terms of the coverage of Gaza. But, basically everything that started in Syria around the time of the Arab Spring, there was some common sentiments of pushing in liberal democratic reforms, stopping some of the corruption of the Assad family, which I think is fair and good, and they have the right to do that. But unfortunately, in the more rural regions of Syria, there was radical elements of Sunni Islam. You have the Salafists and Wahhabist influence that push very radical measures, and there was nothing new. I mean, you could go back to Hafez al-Assad, who was Bashar al-Assad's father, and they had a lot of issues with them.
So shall I tell you something here, which is very, very interesting, right? So what he's saying is there was some liberal elements that wanted to have a revolution when the Arab Spring happened, and some people who were against the corruption of the Assad family, and he kind of just brushes them aside, right? And then what he does here, which is really interesting, he says in the rural areas, these Salafists and extremists, they are the ones who were the problem. Which the reality is that's simply not the case. When I came to Syria in early 2012, what I found was that the majority of people were just actually, their Islam was just an Islam of fitrah. They weren't actually that religious in terms of understanding Aqidah and all of these terminologies and all of these things, right? The only Salafi area actually was Douma. They're Salafi Hanbalis. That's actually probably one of the only prominent areas that was Salafi Hanbali, right? The rest of Syria was predominantly Ash'ari, Sufi, Shafi'is, right? So this radical element that he's talking about from the beginning didn't really exist. It didn't exist. It was very, very, very small, right? The majority of people rose up because they saw the oppression, the suppression. People couldn't even go to the masjid to pray salah. If they would go to pray fajr, then they would be, arrested, tortured, put in prison. They couldn't grow beards. The basic rights as a Muslim, were, so, how can I say, they were so strict that people couldn't, practice their basic Islam. And that's one of the reasons why people rose up.
And they eventually squashed them after massacres that were committed against Ba'athist Party members and the Alawites. And those individuals went to fight for the Mujahideen with the CIA, and they were radicalized by those ideologies there. But the problem with Syria is that...
So what he's talking about now is the massacres that Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar's father, committed in the 80s in Hama. He says squashed them. And these guys were, the ones that were killed were actually Ikhwan al-Muslimin, right? So the way he just glances that over is really, really concerning, to be honest.
A lot of the well-meaning people that were fighting for a more just society as they saw it, whether anyone agrees with that or not doesn't matter, they weren't radicalized. Those movements were completely taken over by the extremists. And some people might be thinking, well, how did that happen? I mean, how did they take over the movement? It happened because people like al-Baghdadi and Jolani, who were in Iraq, felt as though the mission for establishing ISIS, Islamic State, inside of Iraq failed, and they wanted to take that fight to Syria on the border of Iraq. Of course, they were backed by the United States. The United States, the CIA had established rat lines for armed shipments in Libya and in the south of Turkey. They were smuggling in sarin gas. They were smuggling in arms and communication centers for the opposition.
So now this is where my position is quite controversial. I do agree with him here. And I do believe many of these extremist groups like ISIS, right, were backed by America and the West to create this monster so that they could have this global war on terrorism. The way that ISIS was handed certain territories, literally handed them, without even a fight, when being on the ground and seeing that happen, there's so many anecdotal evidences and things that I saw that back up what Jackson's saying in the fact that ISIS and some of these extremist groups were backed by America, CIA and the West. Does that mean though that they controlled all of the Syrian revolution and all of the revolutionary groups here? That's not true. They did have a strong impact. They did assert a lot of control over the Syrian revolution, and that is because of Western backing, but also because there was the moderate Islamic groups were taken out. A group called Ahrar al-Sham famously had all of its leadership killed in an attack when they were having a secret meeting, and all of their leadership was killed in some secret gas attack in a place called Ram Hamdan. You can check this out. Now, up until today, nobody knows who killed the leadership of Ahrar al-Sham. And Ahrar al-Sham was one of the, you could say the more moderate Islamic groups that were not like some of these extremist groups. And later on, they were swallowed up. And today, they have a very, kind of sporadic existence. But at that time, they had a major role to play. And they were a moderate Islamic group.
And the press, Qatar, Turkey, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia called the opposition moderate rebels, but they're actually Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda-linked groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Al-Nusra Front, Jaish al-Islam, all those groups, they're all Al-Qaeda-linked for the most part.
That's not true. They're not all Al-Qaeda-linked. Some of the ones he mentioned are Jaish al-Islam, certainly not. They are vehemently opposed to Al-Qaeda, and they're Salafi Hanbalis. They still exist right now, but they're against Al-Qaeda and they're against ISIS, and they actually fought them.
And they committed horrific atrocities against the people of Syria. Their goal, as they stated, was to establish the management of savagery, as Max Blumenthal put it in his book, and basically wipe out all of the Alawites. They even said it on Al Jazeera. They said that the Alawites brought genocide upon themselves. That's a very troubling thing to have said on an outlet like Al Jazeera. It's even more troubling when you find out that Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the US were all funding and arming the opposition.
Okay, so first of all, this thing about genocide of the Alawites, you got to understand that this is embedded in a lot of the Syrian Sunni majority population because they had a dislike for them. A minority was controlling them. They had all of the power in the country, all the military positions, all the government positions. So that hate was naturally bred into the people. Does that mean that they wanted a genocide? I know many Syrians here in Syria right now with me. They say we used to live with the Alawites as neighbors and we had no issues with them, right? Did some of these extremist groups say that? Yes, they did. But now, once again, to label all of the groups in Syria as extremists that wanted to wipe out Alawites, that's inconsistent and it's unfair, especially when you try and blame it on Islam. And when you don't look at the elephant in the room, which is so similar to the Palestinian situation, so similar to the Palestinian conflict. It's Palestinian land, the Palestinians, they lived there, the Zionists came in and occupied their country and started taking over it slowly. Similarly, the Alawites were a minority. Syria is a Sunni country, and for them to rule over a majority with an iron fist, of course it's going to cause sentiment that is going to mean that the majority are going to want to remove them from power. And sometimes even commit atrocities, which nobody's justifying.
The worst part of all is that Israel also armed the opposition and provided them with a lot of, air superiority in the south.
So when he's talking about the opposition being armed by Qatar and all, the reality is Syria being Bilad al-Sham, every single entity from the east and the west is here trying to arm rebel groups and impose their authority over this land. That is a fact. And this is what you see everywhere. Even now in Palestine, many people are very critical of the Gazans for taking aid and support from Iran. But the reality is, when your back is up against the wall, it's unfair for people to criticize you for taking support from, places that you may not necessarily take support from if you're in a position of strength.
And some people might be wondering, well, why is it happening? If Assad's really such a bad guy, why are they having to work so hard to take him out? And the fact is that Assad you may like him, you may not, but he was the only Arab League state when this began who was still allied with Russia and still allied with Iran. And a lot of people in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United States were worried that this was going to provide some sort of a deepening of Russian influence in the region. And the Gulf states and Al-Qaeda were worried that it was going to provide the deepening of the Shia influence in the region with Iran as one of their closest allies. So, the war continued on.
Well, that's exactly what's happened. The deepening of Shia influence in the region has happened. There's certain areas now which are completely 100% Shia. They were Sunni areas and now they're 100% Shia. Places like Sayyidina Zainab in Damascus was Sunni and now it's been fully taken over by the Shia.
On, and people come up to me and they bring this up and they say, but Jackson, what about the chemical attacks in Ghouta and Douma, or the hundreds of others that were alleged to have happened? And we could, I guess, get into details of that if we want, but those are interesting stories too. Like, there was hundreds of these alleged chemical attacks that took place, but they all took place in areas that were controlled by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So there was no evidence, no proof of anything.
So look, this thing here, which I briefly spoke about in the reel, right? This is complete nonsense. First of all, obviously those attacks are going to be in opposing or opposition or in rebel-controlled territory. He's saying they only happened in Al-Qaeda or ISIS territories. That's completely not true. First of all, Douma was controlled by Jaish al-Islam. They are not Al-Qaeda and they're not ISIS. They fought against them. They hate them till now. They're even fighting Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham as we speak right now. Secondly, Marat Noman, Khan Sheikhoun were areas that were completely opposed to Al-Qaeda. They were having so many protests against Al-Qaeda. They had naturally been a green city, right? Until they fell to the regime, right? So Khan Sheikhoun, I was there. And literally an hour after the chemical weapons fell, I saw people with my own eyes frothing at the mouth. Now, it doesn't make sense for Bashar to bomb his own areas that he's controlling with chemical weapons. How would that make any sense? Of course, it's going to be in opposition-held areas. But Jackson, what he's trying to do is frame any opposition area or every single opposition group as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which is completely wrong.
In most cases, no videos or photos or anything like that. And in 2013, Barack Obama said, my red line for intervention in Syria is to have, a chemical attack that Assad might carry out. And this is what really radicalized me the most about defending Assad, because we saw one of the most horrific acts of the whole war, 1,200.
So he admits that he's radical in his defense of Bashar al-Assad, and the reason for that is Barack Obama. That's crazy.
individuals were killed in eastern Ghouta. And this was done under the guise, allegedly, of Assad carrying out a sarin gas attack on the people there. But came to be James Clapper, Barack Obama, Seymour Hersh. They all found that it was actually a sarin gas attack that was committed by the moderate rebels, which is all these opposition groups, the Free Syrian Army, Al-Nusra Front. And I guess when I initially was following politics...
Like here he's claiming that all of these people found that, I mean, you're opposed to Barack Obama and then you're quoting Barack Obama because they're saying that they found that the rebels done this to themselves. That makes absolutely no sense. I personally know people who are survivors of the chemical attacks in Ghouta. They didn't make this up. This ain't something that just was self-inflicted. That's absolutely ridiculous.
I was not so sympathetic to Syria and Assad, but when I saw that they were killing hundreds, thousands of people in the name of a false flag attack to try and stop Russia's influence in the region, I mean, that was crazy to me. And to this day, we could talk about Duma later.
So this is crazy. So he's basically, in essence, saying he believes America had a hand in these chemical attacks to try and stop Russia. The crazy thing, it doesn't even make sense because Russia's influence increased after those chemical attacks. The chemical attacks came way before the fierce Russian intervention, right? So what he's saying had the opposite effect. It just doesn't make sense.
Later too, but to this day, the one last thing I'll say is that Assad is still struggling against the Western imperialism. ISIS would have taken over Damascus had it not been for Russia. Russia came in 2015, and John Kerry, who was Secretary of State in the Obama administration, was recorded in a secret recording saying that ISIS was running rampant. If it wasn't for Russia coming in, ISIS would have taken over Damascus and slaughtered many of those religious minorities that you mentioned inside of Syria.
You see why this is a massive fallacy, and this can be easily argued. ISIS, when it was at its height of its power, when it had its caliphate, right, from Iraq to Syria, still didn't manage to take out the moderate rebels. And many other Islamic groups, they couldn't take them out. There were vast areas like Idlib and so on and so forth that were still controlled by the Free Syrian Army, the rebels, the opposition. And they were actively also fighting against ISIS. So to say that they would have taken over Damascus and they would have taken over all of Syria, it's just not accurate because there were many people who were still fighting. Did they have a lot of influence? Did they have a lot of support? Did they have a lot of backing from outside? Yes, I firmly believe that. But this is where you can't say on one hand that America and the West, they were backing and they created ISIS, and then on the other hand say that America also did a false flag chemical attack to stop the intervention of Russia. That doesn't make sense.
It would have been a bloodbath. And Russia was actually triggered to come into Syria because Israel and the United States were backing the moderate rebels.
So he's saying Russia was triggered to come into Syria. Russia was always in Syria. Tartus is the biggest naval base that Russia has outside of Russia, or anywhere practically.
So I just don't understand how anyone could condemn a man who is fighting to get his country back. The 1/3 of the country in the Northeast is still controlled by, the United States and the Kurdish allies. They're stealing oil, they're stealing bread. People are starving in Syria. They don't have access to their raw minerals. Petroleum in Syria is the most expensive out of any place in the world.
Okay, so he said, I don't know how you can condemn a man who's fighting to get his country back. First of all, like we said, he's from the minority that was oppressing the majority. So it's never really been his country in the first place, or his father's, right? Secondly, he speaks about now Kurdish-backed American rebels in the Northeast. What about the Northwest, Jackson? You have moderate rebels in the Northwest that are backed by Turkey and Qatar. What do? Do these people not exist? That's where I'm sitting right now, in the northwest.
World. That shouldn't be in a country like Syria that has ample.
And this is where the majority of Sunnis are, by the way, in the northwest. Actually, most of Syria, even Bashar-held territory, it's majority Sunnis as well, right? And the Kurds, they are majority Sunnis as well. So, what he's talking about the economic issues in Syria right now, and petroleum being stolen by America, this is 100% true. All of the areas that ISIS conveniently controlled had oil in them, and when the Americans and the Kurds came and took them out, all of that oil is now in the hands of who? That's right, in the hands of America. So up to there, I do agree with the fact that America has pushed this influence, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that they did support ISIS, because ISIS was that monster. ISIS was, taking over vast swathes of land. They took over all the oil. Once they got all of the oil, what happened? America said, look, we're coming in to save the day. Russia, you can't do it. Moderate rebels, you can't do it. So we're going to do it, and we're going to take all the oil at the same time. And Trump said it very candidly. We're only in Syria because we're taking all the oil, right? And we're only in Iraq because we're taking all the oil. So that's what the Americans' game is here in Syria. It's clear. But to say that America's also kind of, what's the word? All of the rebels in the northwest, and they are puppets to America, and there's no real opposition, is really unfactual, to be honest.
Oil. So, in short, I see Assad as a, I guess, controversial man that maybe didn't do everything right, but no one does. We're humans. But was fighting probably the biggest fight of all in the region, in terms of like the arsenal he was armed with and the arsenal that the opposition was armed with. And he actually proved to be quite successful. And I think that should be.
This is complete nonsense. Do you know that in the first 2 years of the Syrian revolution, the majority of Syria was freed, and not by organized militaries, just by the normal people and masses revolting in their areas and kicking the Bashar military out. And this is why the Bashar regime resorted to weapons like the famous barrel bombs and so on and so forth, bombing civilian areas, bombing their own people to try and get those territories back. They destroyed half the country. To say that Bashar was successful is a crazy statement. If Iran and Russia had not come in to help Bashar al-Assad, there would be no Bashar regime today in Syria.
He prays for what it is.
Well, I'm sure the comment section will have a lot of fun with this topic. Transitioning to another controversial topic, the Uyghur genocide. So, some more context before I let you clarify your position there. The Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group in modern-day China, primarily in what China calls the Xinjiang region. To the Uyghurs, of course, they call this East Turkestan. There are 11 million plus Uyghurs, and they are the second largest Muslim group in China after the Hui people. They have their own language, and their culture is distinct from that of mainland China. The Xinjiang region, or East Turkestan, is autonomously governed, or it was autonomously governed, meaning they govern themselves to an extent despite living under China's governmental system. The Uyghurs consider themselves occupied by China, as the region was conquered by the Chinese in the late 1800s. The Xinjiang region is massive. It is 3 times the size of France and has important resources such as oil, gas, minerals, and even cotton. It's also strategically important to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, with many railroad lines and highways cutting through the territory on its way to Europe. So the region is of vital importance to the Chinese central government. Bear with me. The Uyghurs insist they face discrimination and oppression by the ethnic Han majority. There is a movement to gain independence from China, and there are Islamic groups within Turkestan that use violence to achieve their political goals. The Chinese government claims they are cracking down on security threats in the region to counter terrorism. Part of these crackdowns include the development of internment camps where Uyghurs are allegedly held for what the Chinese government calls job training facilities. The Uyghurs insist that these are propaganda camps where Uyghurs are tortured, raped, beaten, abused, and forced to abandon their cultural and religious beliefs in exchange for a more Chinese identity. There are a lot of details that I am, of course, leaving out for the sake of time. You have claimed that there is no Uyghur genocide taking place, another position that has angered Muslims, leading some to call you a hypocrite. They say you condemn Israeli genocide, but greenlight a Chinese one because of your affinity for the Communist Party and multipolar world order. I'd like you to clarify your position on this. Do you, in fact, deny the quote-unquote genocide, and if so, how would you describe China's actions?
Well, anybody who calls what's happening in China genocide is doing an extreme disservice to those who are fighting a real genocide in Gaza and Palestine, West Bank, all that, because there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. It's all concocted by the State Department and the CIA and the military-industrial complex, both in the United States, Australia, and the...
So this thing, the way he just makes these statements saying there's no evidence, right? What he does here is he just negates every Uyghur Muslim that has family there, and, you know, their families are going through this, they've seen this, the people that have escaped from East Turkestan, it's just, and that's similar to what he does in Syria. He just gives his own narrative when there's literally hundreds and thousands of people from those regions that are telling their story.
In the United Kingdom. And what I think is so, and also, oddly enough, Qatar and Turkey are also backers of this narrative, and Israel. Israel's a big backer of the narrative that there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang, which is hilarious. They've actually gone to the extent of condemning China at the United Nations for allegedly carrying out a genocide against the Uyghur Muslims.
So like for him, if America or the West basically condemn any action because it's, you could say, anti-communist, then, you know, it must be some kind of conspiracy theory. But you see, what we have to understand as Muslims is that communism is an ideology which he adheres to. Capitalism is the ideology of the West or the world order. And our ideology is Islam. So at times, Islam is going to align with either of these ideologies, right? And this is where people get confused with Jackson, because communism or the communist parties at the moment support the Palestinian resistance simply for the fact that it's against imperialism and against America and against Israel, then that's where it will line up. When you look at any other conflict where, doesn't matter what the circumstances are, it's against Russia and China, then those people are in the wrong. And that's basically Jackson Hinkle's moral compass. And I could bet that this guy is on the payroll. He's being paid big bucks by China, big bucks by Russia to do and say the things that he's saying, because he's doing amazing propaganda for them. He's doing amazing propaganda to have a white American young man pushing this narrative could be really, really lucrative. Let's be honest about it. I'm sure that there'll be many Russian billionaires and oligarchs that want to pay him big money to say the things that he's saying.
I think that, you know, you touched on some important points there. Yes, this region, Xinjiang, is very important to China, but it's also very important to the rest of the world. There was a very famous godfather of geopolitics in the 1940s. His name was Mackinder, and he termed the phrase the Eurasian heartland, which is essentially like the Xinjiang region, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, all those regions. And the idea is that this is such a resource-rich region of the world, and not only is it resource-rich, but it connects China, which at the time and for many, many thousands of years has been a region that is highly populated with, the Middle East, with Iran, with Russia to the north, and further down with Europe. It's where all this, some of the major routes on the Silk Road were. So this region is very important, and the CIA has spent a lot of time and a lot of money over the past like 50 or so years since Brzezinski to try and take control of that region and establish U.S. subservient leaders in that region, or to balkanize China in the case of Xinjiang. Balkanize means to split it up, so you wouldn't have one China, you'd have a bunch of smaller Chinese states, which weakens the power of it. And the newest iteration of that is what we're seeing with this claim of a genocide in Xinjiang. But to give a little bit more context on the history, essentially the claims of, violent acts in the name of East Turkestan Uyghur separatism are true. Between 1996 and the early 2000s, there was, I think, about two.
See, the thing is, we know as Muslims that anyone that is practicing Islam is basically a radicalist. So what in essence, let's read between the lines, what in essence he is saying is, anyone that's practicing Islam, right, and wants to defend their basic rights as a Muslim, to pray salah, to go to the masjid, to not eat pork, to wear the hijab, to dress in an Islamic way, which all of our, Turkestani brothers tell us that they are denied the rights of, and we have many, many Turkestanis here in Syria, by the way, fighting against Bashar al-Assad. They tell us this, they tell us how they've been oppressed over all of these years. They tell us how their families have been taken to these concentration camps and indoctrinated, and all because they are trying to do what? To practice their religion. And to people like Jackson, they'll use the terrorism card. These people are violent thugs. They're violent terrorists. The reason why? Just because they're defending their religion.
They're being paid by Radio Free Asia, which is also funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Those individuals, the radical elements, they don't represent the overwhelming majority of the Uyghur people. The overwhelming majority of the Uyghur people, frankly, I think they just want to live a happy life. I think they want to have mosques to go and pray at. I think they want to have the ability to live a functioning life in China, and they want to have a safe neighborhood with good jobs. That's kind of the basics of life, When it comes to the Xinjiang region, China's built over 20,000 mosques. There's these videos going viral on social media of mosques being destroyed, and then we come to find out it's in a different country halfway across the world. The number one celebrity in China is a Uyghur Muslim. The Uyghur Muslim population is actually increasing at a faster rate than the Han Chinese population because they weren't held to the one China policy in Xinjiang. Uyghur Muslim script is written on all the national currencies. I was just in China, so I got to see it myself. We don't even do that for Native Americans here, which I think is interesting. But the history of these terror attacks with Uyghur radicals began after some of them went to go fight with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They became radicalized by this ideology that was exported from Saudi Arabia. They then came back to Xinjiang to try and establish a free Xinjiang. And when that didn't happen, there wasn't enough people. They began to do these terror attacks, some of which killed hundreds of people, very large ones, some of which weren't as deadly. They also tried to actually seize an Airbus and crash an Airbus in China, which would have been horrific, but it was stopped. And at the end of the day, I guess their mission for establishing a free and independent East Turkestan failed. So now they're having to rely on the international Western community to try and bankroll them and further exacerbate the...
So look, it's really interesting what he's saying. He'll just negate any of the struggles of the Uyghurs because basically they're fighting against Russia and Iran. So it doesn't matter. He will just gloss over it, say there's no evidence, Russia and America are backing this, simply because of the fact that it's against Russia and Iran, Russia and China. And this is one of the things that where there is some truth is the fact that Muslims who are in situations like this, where they are being oppressed and they're fighting for their independence, they're fighting for their basic rights, they're not so politically, astute, you could say, they will reach out an arm and take support from America and the West. Of course they would, because they're fighting an oppressor. So for them, they would take aid from anywhere. And we see this in many conflicts around the world. But that does not mean that they tacitly support and have love for those regimes that are supporting them. They know that that support comes with conditions, right? The reality of the world that we live in today is that there's two major world powers. You've got the West, America, the capitalist, institutions of the world, and then you've got the smaller superpowers or the ex-superpowers, which is Russia and China, who are also trying to establish their dominance and communism, right? And the Muslims, unfortunately, because of the crisis that we're in, we are kind of in a decimated state, and we're just split all over the place, trying to take any support we can from wherever we can.
Claims that they're putting out of genocide. The claim of genocide is interesting because it was actually initiated by U.S. government workers who went to Xinjiang, a region of 11 million people, and they interviewed a grand total of 8 Uyghur Muslims in a region of 11 million people. They did this because they went to 8 different villages, interviewed one person in each village, and said, roughly, how many people do you know of who are imprisoned in a concentration camp, they called it. And he said, like 250 people, 300 people, 400 people I know personally. Then they extrapolated those numbers, those percentages, on the entire population of 11 million Uyghur Muslims. So that's how you get those crazy numbers of 2 to 3 million people being in these camps. There was just a big Uyghur tribunal that was held, World Uyghur Tribunal that was held, which was an effort to, I guess, encourage Western businesses to look at this propaganda and to cease doing any business in the Xinjiang region. And even at this World Uyghur Congress, or the tribunal they called it, the official, Uyghur CIA paid propaganda said that there was only 5,571 documented Uyghurs that they could point to who were put in these camps. So that, according to them, that's their own stat of verifiable evidence that they have. Besides that, there was not a single case of hard evidence that was actually presented in the tribunal. There was a lot of testimonies that have been proven in one way or another to be lies because some of the main people who gave testimonies and witnesses of the alleged crimes or people who were victim to it have changed their stories like hundreds of times when they go on CNN or the BBC or wherever. And it's kind of like that Yeonmi Park figure from North Korea. Like every other week, she's telling a crazy story about North Korea that's just so unbelievable. But the whole goal of this, in short, is basically the United States knows that if it can economically weaken the Xinjiang region, you're going to have more people fall into poverty. You're going to have more people that become critical of the Chinese government. You're going to have more people that maybe even fall into that radical terrorism that was brought from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And overall, that's going to sow discord and destabilization for China. And China's done a very good job of implementing 5-year economic, in some cases 10-year economic plans in the region to try and actually uplift the standard of living of those people. And it worked. There's like a lot more jobs that were operating there. Cotton industry is really big there. I think even Elon Musk might have some business out there, if I remember correctly. But what the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are doing in trying to sow these seeds of, genocide, conspiracy, it causes Western businesses to say, okay, well, there's this really bad story out there about how there's a genocide happening there. We have factories out there. We're getting our cotton from there. It wouldn't be that much more expensive if we did our business in Indonesia or in Taiwan instead. So let's just take our entire factory and the thousands of jobs and move them elsewhere. When you do that, the Uyghur people are left without jobs. And actually, there's been some organizations that have had to pay out hundreds of thousands of dollars to Uyghurs for making up those lies and causing them to lose their jobs. So this has all the earmarkings of a CIA, destabilization effort. I have a story about it on my Instagram. People can go look at all the details because too many to even answer in this one question. But overall,
so look here. One thing that's really important is just because the CIA or America or the West are trying to establish power in a region, that doesn't mean that the Muslims there are not oppressed. What it means is that America and the West will go into regions where people are oppressed, and of course they will try and capitalize on that. Why does it have to be why do they have to be diametrically opposed ideas, right? The reality is both of these different powers are trying to exert their influence on the world, and unfortunately in many of those places right now, it's Muslims who are the ones who are paying the price. They are basically the pawns, and that's the reality that we are in at the moment because of the disunity within the Ummah, because of the fact that most of our leaders are puppets. This is why we are in the situation where we are just pawns or cannon fodder, if you want to call it that.
Do I think that there's those re-education camps? I mean, I don't know how much they're still doing there, the labor camps, whatever they call them. I mean, we don't really know what they're doing in there, but it's very clear that it's not a genocide or anything like that. I mean, it's...
So he says he doesn't know what's going on in these camps, right? You don't seem to know much about what's going on over there, right? How about you go there and try and film like every other journalist has, and they haven't been able to?
2024, if there's a genocide, it'd be filmed. There's only been one photo of an alleged camp that has been published. It's with all the guys in the blue jackets. That was actually a drug rehab facility. So those images go viral. That's not even one of the alleged, re-education or labor camps that everyone talks about. There were 4 satellite photos of the alleged camps. I think Vice News published them. One of those photos was a middle school, one of them was a high school, one of them was a logistics center, and one of them was a cell tower center. So it's like, they use these same old tactics, like when they said they had satellite photos to prove that there were WMD in Iraq, and then they have satellites to prove that there's a genocide going on in China. And there's too many inconsistencies and too many red flags here, and frankly, no evidence whatsoever to back the claims that there's a genocide. So that's why I say people who put forward these claims, it's doing a disservice to the real genocide happening in Gaza. And actually, you're hurting Uyghur Muslims inside of China because, you're causing them to lose their jobs and have more poverty in and around them, which should be the opposite of someone if you want to help the people. So it's, West, as Putin said, you can't beat Western propaganda. And that's the case definitely with this region.
Okay, pivoting to a less controversial discussion. Back to your social media. Tell us about your tactics.
So yeah, I mean, they're the two clearly massively controversial opinions that he has, but you can see how pro-Russian he is, and that's what dictates his moral compass and his politics, right? And this is where people have to be clear. You have to choose your allies wisely, and sometimes your allies, sometimes people who are going to be supporting your causes are not actually your allies. They actually have their own agendas, like Jackson Hinkle clearly does.
So your strategies to spread your message and grow your brand. You can be pretty incendiary online, cursing out public figures and being vulgar. Why do you do this?
Well, I do it because I believe it and I feel it. It's like, you look at these people and they truly are.
So I think that wraps up most of what I want to talk about. The main takeaway that I'll take away, or the main message that I'll give to everybody is that as Muslims, our moral compass needs to be what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what is in line with the Sharia. That should be what dictates our moral compass, because ultimately that is what is better for our dunya and for our akhirah, and that's what is humane. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is best for the people, for us, it's important to speak the truth, whether it's for us or against us. As Muslims, we are not allowed to massacre the enemy. There are rules of engagement. And it's very well documented that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, when he retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders, no blood was spilt. Whereas when the Crusaders took Jerusalem from the Muslims, the streets were filled with blood. So, these people are not our teachers. We have a beautiful divine religion. We have the right way. But what's important is we have to come back to our deen, and we have to search and work hard for unity. Because if we stay as we are, disunited in the way that we are, like the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ said, that the nations will gather and feast upon us like they are sitting around a massive dining table, piece by piece. And when the Sahaba asked, is this because we will be small in number? The Prophet ﷺ said, no, you'll be great in number, but you'll be like the froth of the sea. And this is what we see today, my dear brothers and sisters. Today, it is shocking that we can see what is happening in Gaza take place in front of our eyes, and yet nobody moves. There is no movement. There is no change, right? The situation in China or East Turkestan is slightly different because it's a silent genocide. What he said about America putting someone in Israel instead of Netanyahu, who could commit a silent genocide, is exactly what's happening in China right now. It's a silent genocide. We don't see so much. It's all kind of covered. It's all hidden. And that's what makes it even more sinister. And that's where, in some ways, I do agree with him about Netanyahu. Alhamdulillah, because of Netanyahu's crimes, right? In a strange, sick way, alhamdulillah, it's emboldening people. Even now, in the outside community, people are supporting Palestine more than they've ever supported it. So alhamdulillah, that's an amazing thing. Of course, we don't want to see our brothers and sisters die. And it's pitiful that that will be the only response. But sadly, this is where we are today. So this is where I'll wrap up today's reaction. Inshallah ta'ala, Ramadan's coming. I don't think I'm going to have much time for many more of these. And I hope that you guys found my comments beneficial. If you did, please like, share and subscribe. And inshallah, put your comments below if you agree with me, if you don't agree with me. And inshallah ta'ala, I'll try and respond to you guys. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.